66. Self-actualization, PT1. Hesitation is always easy, rarely useful. So the defense professor had told him, and while you could quibble about the details of the proverb, Harry understood the weaknesses of Ravenclaws well enough to know that you had to try answering your own quibbles. Did some plans call for waiting? Yes, many plans called for delayed action, but that was not the same as hesitating to choose. Not delaying because you knew the right moment to do what was necessary, but delaying because you couldn't make up your mind. There was no cunning plan which called for that. Did you sometimes need more information to choose? Yes, but that could also turn into an excuse for delaying, and it would be tempting to delay when you were faced with a choice between two painful alternatives, and not choosing would avoid the mental pain for a time. You would pick a piece of information you couldn't easily obtain and claim that you couldn't possibly decide without it. That would be your excuse. Although if you knew what information you needed, knew when and how you would obtain that information, and knew what you would do depending on each possible observation, then that was less suspicious as an excuse for hesitating. If you weren't just hesitating, you ought to be able to choose in advance what you would do, once you had the extra information you claimed you needed. If the Dark Lord were really out there, would it be smart to go along with Professor Quirrell's plan to have someone impersonate the Dark Lord? No, definitely no, absolutely not. And if Harry knew for a fact that the Dark Lord wasn't really out there, in that case, the defense professor's office was a small room, at least today. It had changed since the last time Harry had seen it, the stone of the room becoming darker, more polished. Behind the defense professor's desk stood the single empty bookcase that always decorated the room, a tall bookcase stretching almost from the floor to the ceiling, with 7 empty wooden shelves. Harry had only once seen Professor Quirrell take a book from those empty shelves, and never seen him put a book back. The green snake swayed above the seat of the chair behind the defense professor's desk, the lidless eyes staring unblinking at Harry from close to his own eye level. They were warded now by 22 spells, all that could be cast within Hogwarts without attracting the headmaster's attention. No, hissed Harry. The green snake cocked its head, tilting it slightly. No emotion was conveyed by the gesture, not that Harry's Parselmouth talent conveyed to him. Riassen not, said the green snake. Too risky, Harry said simply. That was true whether or not the Dark Lord was out there. Forcing himself to decide in advance had made him realize that he'd just been using the unanswered question as an excuse to hesitate. The sane decision was the same, either way. For a moment the dark pitted eyes seemed to gleam blackly. For a moment the scaled mouth gaped to expose the fangs. Think you have learned wrong lesson, boy, from previous failure. My plants are not in habit of failing, and last one would have gone flawlessly, but for your own foolishness. Correct lesson is to follow steps laid down for you by Older and Wisser Slytherin. Tame your wild impulses. Lesson I learned is not to try plots that would make girl-child friend think I am evil or boy-child friend think I am stupid, Harry snapped back. He'd been planning a more temporizing response than that, but somehow the words had just slipped out. The ing sound that came from the snake was not heard by Harry as words, only as pure fury. A moment later, you told them, of course not, but know what they would say. There was a long pause as the snakehead swayed, staring at Harry. Again, no detectable emotion came through, and Harry wondered what Professor Quirrell could be thinking that would take Professor Quirrell that long to think. You seriously care what thus to think, came the snake's final hiss. True younglings thus too are not like you, could not weigh adult matters. Might have done better than me, Harry hissed. Boy-child friend would have asked after secret motives before assenting to rescue woman. Glad you understand that now, the snake hissed coldly. Always ask after others' advantage. Next learn to always ask after your own. If my plan is not to your task, what is yours? If necessary, stay at school 6 years and study. Hogwarts seems fine place to dwell. Books, friends, strange but tasty food. Harry wanted to chuckle, but there wasn't any gesture in Parseltongue for the kind of laughter he wanted to express. The pits of the snake's eyes seemed almost black. Easy to say that now. As such as you and I, we do not tolerate imprisonment. You will lost patience long before 7th year, perhaps before end of this S1. I shall plan accordingly. And before Harry could hiss another word of Parseltongue, The human shape of Professor Quirrell was sitting in his chair once more. "So, Mr. Potter," said the defense professor, his voice as calm as if they had been discussing nothing important, as if the whole conversation had not occurred at all, "I hear that you have begun to practice dueling. Not the worthless sort with rules, I hope." Hannah Abbott looked as unnerved as Hermione had ever seen her, except on the day of the Phoenix, the day Bellatrix Black had escaped, which should not to count for anyone. The Hufflepuff girl had come over to the Ravenclaw table during dinner and tapped Hermione on her shoulder and very nearly dragged her away. "Neville and Harry Potter are learning dueling from Mr. Diggory," Hannah blurted as soon as they were a few steps away from the table. "Who?" said Hermione. "Cedric Diggory," said Hannah. "He's the captain of our Quidditch team and general of an army, and he's taking all the electives and getting better grades than anyone. And I hear he learns dueling from professional tutors during the summers, and he once beat 2 seventh-year students, and even some teachers call him the Super Hufflepuff, and Professor Sprout says we should all emudate him or something like that." And after Hannah finally stopped for air, the list had gone on for a while. Hermione managed to insert a word in edgewise. "Sunshine Soldier Abbott," said Hermione. "Calm down. We're not going to be fighting General Diggory, right? Sure, Neville's studying to beat us, but we can study too, don't you see?" Hannah shrieked, raising her voice a lot louder than it should have been if they were trying to keep the conversation private from all the Ravenclaws looking at them. "Neville isn't studying to beat us. He's practicing so he can fight Bellatrix Black. They're going to go through us like a bludger through a stack of pancakes." The Sunshine General gave her soldier a look. "Listen," said Hermione, "I don't think a few weeks of practice is going to make anyone an invincible fighter. Plus, we already know how to handle invincible fighters. We'll concentrate fire on them and they'll go down just like Draco." The Hufflepuff girl was looking at her with mixed admiration and skepticism. "Aren't you even, worried?" "Oh, honestly," said Hermione. "Sometimes it was hard being the only sensible person in your whole school year. Haven't you ever heard the saying, 'The only thing we have to fear is fear itself'?" "What?" said Hannah. "That's crazy. What about Letherfolds lurking in the darkness, and being put under the Imperious Curse, and horrible transfiguration accidents, and—" "I mean," said Hermione, exasperation leaking out into her now-raised voice. She'd been hearing this sort of thing all week now. "How about if we wait until after the Chaos Legion actually crushes us to get so scared of them, and did you just mutter Gryffindors under your voice?" A few moments later, Hermione was walking back to her place at the table with a sweet smile plastered onto her young face. It wasn't the terrible cold glare of Harry's dark side, but it was the scariest face she knew how to make. Harry Potter was going down. "This is loony," gasped Neville, with what tiny amount of breath he could spare from being completely out of breath. "This is brilliant," said Cedric Diggory. The eyes of the Super Hufflepuff gleamed with manic enthusiasm, shining like the sweat on his forehead as he stamped his feet through the dance of one of his dueling postures. His usually light steps had changed to heavier stomps, which might have had something to do with the transfigured metal weights they'd all attached to their arms and legs and strapped over their chests. "Where do you get these ideas, Mr. Potter?" "A strange old shop in Oxford, and I'm never shopping there again." Thud. 67. Self-Actualization, PT2. In the high reaches of Hogwarts, where rooms and corridors changed on a daily basis, where the territory itself was uncertain, and not just the map, where the stability of the castle began to fray into dreams and chaos without changing its architectural style or apparent solidity. In the high reaches of Hogwarts, a battle would soon be fought. The presence of so many students would stabilize the corridors for a time, by dint of constant observation. The rooms and corridors of Hogwarts sometimes moved even while people looked directly at them, but they wouldn't change. Even after 8 centuries, Hogwarts was still a little shy about changing in front of people. But despite that transient permanence, the defense professor had said, the upper reaches of Hogwarts still had a military realism. You had to learn the ground anew each time, and check every closet for secret corridors all over again. Sunday it was, Sunday the 1st of March. Professor Quirrell had recovered enough to supervise battles once more, and they were all catching up on the backlog. The Dragon General, Draco Malfoy, watched 2 compasses he held in either hand. One compass was the color of the sun. The other had a multicolored, iridescent sheen to indicate chaos. The other two generals, Draco knew, had been given their own compasses. Only Hermione Granger's hand, and Harry Potter's hand, would hold a compass that was orange-red and flickered in its reflections like fire, pointing always to the direction of the largest active contingent of dragon army. Without those compasses, they might have searched for days and never found each other, which was a territorial hazard of fighting in the upper levels of Hogwarts. Draco had a bad feeling about what would happen when Dragon Army found the Chaos Legion. Harry Potter had changed since Bellatrix Black had escaped. The air of Slytherin had begun to seem truly lordly now, and how had Professor Quirrell known that would happen? Draco would have felt a lot better with Hermione Granger standing alongside him with her 23 Sunshine soldiers in tow. But no, the Sunshine General was being stupidly proud and refusing to accept aid against General Potter. She wanted to take down Potter herself, she'd told him. The noble and most ancient house of Malfoy had maintained their influence over Britain for centuries by understanding that you couldn't always be the most powerful. Sometimes another lord was just stronger, and you had to settle for merely being his foremost lieutenant. You could build up quite a position of wealth and power over a dozen generations of being second in command. You just had to be careful, each time, not to let your house be dragged down with the fall of the lord you served. That was the Malfoy tradition which centuries of experience had honed. And so Father had thoroughly explained to Draco that if he ran into someone who was obviously stronger than him, Draco was not to resent this, and not to deny it, and not to throw a tantrum that could sabotage his potential position. But Draco was to make sure that his place in the next generation's power structure wasn't any lower than second. Granger, apparently, had never gotten this lecture from her own parents, and was still in denial about the obvious fact that Harry Potter was becoming stronger than her. So Draco had secretly met with Captain Goldstein and Captain Bones and Captain Macmillan, and they'd agreed to all do their best to make sure that Dragon and Sunshine didn't engage each other before they engaged the larger threat of chaos. It wasn't really violating the agreement against traitors. You weren't soliciting traitors if you honestly meant to help the other army. A high ringing tone belled through the corridors to signal the start of the battle, and a moment later Draco shouted, "Go!" And the dragons started running. It would tire his soldiers. It would cost them something even after they stopped and caught their breath. But they had to put chaos directly between themselves and the Sunshine Regiment. Harry and Neville walked at a leisurely pace through the corridors, Harry watching the yellow-golden compass that pointed toward the location of the Sunshine Regiment, and Neville keeping a lookout just in case they ran into someone else. Their footsteps sounded a bit thumpy, if you listened closely. "So," the chaotic lieutenant said after a while, "that's why you had us practice dueling with all that weight strapped on." Harry nodded, keeping his eyes on the compass that led to Sunshine. If the apparent direction started to change quickly, then they were getting close. "I didn't want to say anything in front of the others, but a couple of weeks isn't a lot of time to put on extra muscle," said Neville. "And the balance is different, and I think this weighs more actually, and doesn't this count as transfiguring a Muggle artifact?" "Nope," Harry said. "I checked that in advance. You can see it in Hogwarts statues, so some wizards used to wear it, even if they were just being fashionable for the Dark Ages. And since nobody would ever try this if they weren't fighting first-year students using weak spells like the Sleep Hex, it didn't count as giving away good ideas, either." They came to a Y intersection, an annoying one. Neither corridor bent in quite the right way to take them on a direct intercept course toward where Sunshine would go as they followed the Chaos Legion following Dragon Army. So Harry chose what seemed like the better of the two options, and Neville followed. "We better try a quick silencing charm on this stuff when we get close," Neville said. "It's kind of noisy. They might figure it out." Harry nodded, and then said, "Good idea," in case Neville hadn't been looking at him. They trudged on through the stone-floored corridor of the upper reach of Hogwarts, lit by windows of plain glass or stained glass, now and then passing statues of witches and dragons, and even the occasional wizard knight in plate armor or chainmail. The Sunshine soldiers were striding through a long, wide corridor with their wands out and pointed. They couldn't use the prismatic shield while they were maneuvering, but Parvati Patil and Jenny Rustad were currently maintaining contigos around the officer group, who would be the first targets of any ambush. Their tactic for the next battle, she and her officers had decided, would be to mix directly in with the enemy soldiers as fast as possible, after having practiced among themselves how to support one another, avoid hitting each other, and get into positions where enemy soldiers would hesitate to fire. They'd only gotten in 4 hours' practice, but she thought her troops would already be better at that kind of mixed-in fighting than soldiers who hadn't practiced at all. It seemed like the sort of tactic Chaos would use, but they hadn't actually used it yet. It was a good strategy, she believed. And yet still, no matter how much she'd lectured her soldiers, they persisted in whispering fearful rumors about what Harry and Neville were learning to do. Finally, she'd gone off and talked with Captain Goldstein, who understood things like troop morale, and Anthony had suggested, "That's weird." Captain Macmillan spoke up suddenly, frowning at the fiery and iridescent compasses he held in either hand. Ernie was, as Harry would have termed it, good at spatial visualization, and so had been designated to hold both compasses and try to figure out what their enemies were doing. "I think dragons not moving fast anymore. I think they got on the other side of Chaos from us first, and it looks like Chaos is moving to attack them instead of trying to maneuver out from in between." Hermione frowned, trying to understand, and she saw similar frowns on the faces of Anthony and Ron. If Chaos and Dragon attacked each other straight out and spent all their forces fighting each other, that was practically conceding the battle to Sunshine. "Potter thinks we're allied, so he's attacking Malfoy now, before Dragon can link up with us," said Blaise Zabini from the common ranks of soldiers. "Or Potter just thinks he can beat both armies in a row if he attacks them separately." The Slytherin boy gave a condescending sigh. "Are you going to promote me back to officer now? You lot are hopeless without me, you know." They all ignored the talking noises coming from Zabini's mouth. "We still moving in the right direction," said Anthony. "Yeah," said Ernie. "We getting close to them," said Ron. "Not yet." That was when the huge black wooden doors at the end of the corridor flew open and crashed into the wall, revealing two figures almost completely enveloped in grey cloaks. Grey cloth stretched over the faces beneath the grey hoods, one of those figures already raising a wand and pointing it directly at her. And then the face of the game changed drastically as Harry's voice, high and strained with the effort, screamed the word, "Stupefy." The dueling grade stunner blasted toward her. She was so shocked that she didn't start to move until almost too late, as the red jet of light smashed right through the Contigo shield to their front, and she just barely dodged. There was a tingle on her arm as the red light went past her, and she saw out of the corner of her eye Susan getting hit and blown off her feet into Ron, Somnium, bellowed Anthony's voice, followed a moment later by a dozen voices crying, "Somnium." Hermione frantically pushed herself to her feet, and as she rose, she saw the two figures in the grey cloaks just standing there. You couldn't see sleep hexes, the spell was too weak, but there was no way they all could have missed. "Stupefy!" shrieked the voice of Neville Longbottom, and another red jet shot at her. She fell in an undignified heap as she desperately twisted out of the way, and when she scrambled up, panting, she saw that this time the stunbolt had gotten Ron where he'd been rising from the ground. "Hello there, Sunshine," said Harry's voice from beneath his hood. "We're the Grey Knights of Chaos," said Neville's voice. "We'll be your opponents for this battle," said Harry's voice, "while Chaos's other army slaughters the dragons. And by the way," said Neville's voice, "we're invincible." The two boys in their grey cloaks and robes, grey cloth over their faces, stood facing Sunshine's entire army, seemingly unfazed by a dozen sleep hexes. Daphne heard a soft sigh from beside her, and when her head turned, she saw that Hannah's lips were parted, and the Hufflepuff girl's eyes were huge, and she was staring at. It would have been hard to describe the jumble of thoughts that flashed through Daphne's mind as she realized that Hannah was staring at Neville rather than Harry, which in turn seemed to trigger some part of her into noticing that in point of fact, Neville had been getting pretty interesting lately as boys went. In fact, right now, the last sign of Longbottom was seeming downright cool, and something woke up inside her, and her own lips parted, and everything the lady her mother had ever instructed her about demure demeanors and flattery, and scented shampoo blew straight out of her mind, so hard it should have fluffed her hair about her ears. Because she'd watched Hermione and Harry, and she knew how she wanted her own courtship to go. Her lady mother had also recently instructed her on a few spells. It might be embarrassing not to know if you belong to the noble and most ancient house of Greengrass. Daphne's wand swung to point to her left, and she shouted Tane. The wand went over her head, and she spoke the incantation, Ravum Calvaria. And finally she grasped her wand in both hands and shrieked, Lucis Gladius. The huge magical drain almost sent her to her knees, but she bore it, and when the blazing shape had fully formed and stabilized, the drain was a little less. Still, she had a feeling she'd better not try to fight with this for long. That everyone was staring at her went quite without saying, and she should have leaped forward to confront Neville with her hair billowing around her. But it was all she could do to walk forward steadily to level her most ancient blade at Neville Longbottom. That everyone moved aside and made way for her also went without saying. "I hight Daphne, of the noble and most ancient house of Greengrass," she cried. Greengrass of sunshine. The dueling forms had gone completely out of her mind. She'd seen enough plays to remember death challenges and blood challenges, but she couldn't remember at all what was appropriate for this. So she just pointed the incandescent sword toward the object of her crush and yelled, "Let's see what you got, Nevy." Once again Harry's voice shrieked stupefy. And later on, when she was remembering this, she could never quite believe she'd managed to do it, but she slashed out with a blade of light like it was a beater's bat, and hit the stunbolt back at Harry, who just barely managed to twist out of the way. "Tarnair," shouted Neville, of the noble and most ancient house of Longbottom. "Ravum Calvaria, Lucis Gladius." For a few seconds, no one did anything but stare at Neville and Daphne as they started whacking at each other. They were both moving slowly, and Hermione guessed that the spell was taking a lot of strength out of them. It wasn't very impressive by comparison if you were a Muggle-born and you'd watched certain movies, but you still had to give them extra credit for using lightsabers at all. "Point of order," said Harry's voice. "I know the defense professor is watching, but I still have to ask, does anyone know whether they'll slice each other in half if they actually hit?" "No," Hermione said absently. This had been in one of her history books, though she'd had no idea the magical dueling sword looked like that. "They cast it so it'll only stun if it touches. You know that spell." "Oh no, it's the charm of the most ancient blade. It's only legal for noble and most ancient houses to use." Hermione stopped talking and looked at Harry, or Harry's grey hood rather. "Well," said Harry's voice, "I guess I could take down the rest of the Sunshine Regiment by myself then." She couldn't see his face, but his voice sounded like he was smiling. "You dodged when Daphne hit your own spell back at you," Hermione said. "So whatever you did, you're not invincible. A stupefy can still get you." "Interesting theory," said Harry's voice from beneath the hood. "Got anyone in your army who can test it?" "I read about the stunning hex once," said Hermione. "A few months ago. I wonder if I can remember the instructions right." Her wand came up to point at Harry. There was a slight pause, as nearby a boy and a girl breathing in audible gasps slowly whacked at each other with lightsabers. "Of course," Harry said, leveling his own wand on her. "I can just use Somnium on you. That'll take a lot less effort." New Contigo shields sprung into existence in front of her, cast by Jenny and Parvati, even as Harry spoke. The tip of Hermione's own wand began making small motions in the air, a diamond within a circle, rehearsing the gesture to match exactly what she remembered seeing in the book. It would be a difficult feat even for her, but she had to cast the spell right on the first try. She couldn't afford any failed castings that would sap her energy. "You know," said Hermione Granger, "I understand that it's not really your fault, but I'm getting tired of hearing people talk about the boy who lived like you're some kind of god or something." "Same here, I must say," said Harry Potter. "It's sad how people keep underestimating me." Her wand kept rehearsing the diamond within the circle over and over. Harry would be recharging his own strength, she knew, even as she practiced as much as she could before her attack. "I'm starting to think you need taking down a peg, General Chaos." "You could be right," Harry said equably. His feet began to shuffle through what she recognized as a duelist's dance. "Unfortunately, there's nothing left that can defeat me now except another Harry Potter." "Let me be specific, Mr. Potter." "I'm taking you down a peg." "You and what other army? You think you're pretty cool, don't you?" said Hermione. "Why, yes," said Harry. Yes, I do. Some might call that arrogant, but am I supposed to be the last person in Hogwarts to notice how awesome I am? Hermione raised her left hand into the air and made a fist. It was a signal. 8 designated soldiers in her army would be pointing their wands at her and quietly casting Wingardium Leviosa. They'd practiced this too, once Hermione had given up on lecturing her soldiers, and at Anthony's suggestion, tried giving them a sunshine general who looked like she could defeat invincible enemies. "You pretend you're Superman," said Hermione. She raised her left fist higher in the air, and the 8 soldiers supporting her hovered her off the ground. Well, here's Super Hermione. Her hand pushed forward, and as she shot rapidly through the air toward Harry, regretting only that she couldn't see the look on his face, her wand made a diamond within a circle, and she summoned up all the magic she could. It felt like she imagined touching a live wire would feel as the too powerful spell poured through her when her voice screamed, "Stupefy." The red bolt burst from her wand, perfectly formed. Harry dodged it. And then, because they hadn't practiced doing this part inside of hallways, she crashed into a wall. "Somnium!" shrieked Draco, and then after only a few seconds to recharge, "Somnium, curse you." He knew he was hitting Theodore. The other boy wasn't even trying to dodge, but the scion of not only grinned as evilly as his father and leveled his wand. Draco managed to leap aside just as Theodore said, "Somnium." But Draco was getting winded. He couldn't keep this up. Theodore wasn't bothering to dodge at all while Draco had to keep moving. This was crazy. He had enough strength now to fire again. But stupidity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Harry had said. This was Harry's work somehow. It couldn't be a muggle artifact anymore, but Draco couldn't figure out what it could be. And he should be thinking of hypotheses and ways to test them. But he was too busy frantically dodging as Theodore laughed and shot another sleep hex at him. Draco felt a little numbness in his side that time as he twisted. That had been a very, very near miss, and finally Draco couldn't take it anymore. He didn't bother working out what theory he was testing, or why is he just Luminos. Shouted Draco, and Theodore was haloed in red light, Dulac. And it went out again, so Theodore was still being affected by magic, Expelliarmus. And Theodore's wand went flying. That had been a good spell to cast anyway now that Draco realized it. But Theodore was rushing toward Draco with his arms outstretched to grapple, so Draco yelled, "Flipendo." And the other boy's feet were abruptly yanked up, and Theodore's back hit the ground with a surprisingly loud and metallic-sounding crash. Draco's vision was swimming now from casting 4 spells in such fast succession, and Theodore was already scrambling to his feet, so there wasn't even time to think in words, but Draco still managed to say Somnium. And this time he aimed for Theodore's face instead of the chest. Theodore dodged, he dodged, and the boy shouted Code 7 on Malfoy. "Prismates!" cried Padma's voice, and there was suddenly a shimmering rainbow wall in front of Draco, just as 4 chaotic voices cried Somnium. And there was a pause, as everyone looked at the huge prismatic sphere protecting the remnants of Dragon Army. Casting that 5th spell had sent Draco to his hands and knees, but he looked up and managed to say, as clearly as he could, "If the sleep hex doesn't work, aim for the face. I think the lieutenants are wearing metal shirts." "You've already lost too many soldiers," Finnegan said loudly from across the barrier. "We'll beat you anyway." And then the Gryffindor boy laughed evilly. He did the evil laughter almost as well as Harry Potter by now, and the other chaotic legionnaires started laughing with him soon afterward. Draco could see from the corner of his eye where Gregory and Vincent lay unconscious. Padma was still sustaining the prismatic sphere, the largest one he'd ever seen her cast, but she was breathing hard, still visibly sweaty from when they'd all jogged to get into position. The Ravenclaw girl was a strong witch, but not an athletic one. He really hoped General Granger got here soon and hit Chaos from behind. General Potter and Neville of Chaos were missing, and Draco could guess where they'd gone, but 2 soldiers couldn't delay the whole Sunshine Regiment for too long all by themselves, could they? She knew it wasn't fair, that the other girl had given all she could, but Hermione still wished that Daphne had lasted longer. "Lagan," said Neville's voice from behind her as she flew, and there was the sound of a prismatic wall shattering. Hannah's voice desperately cried, "Somnium." And then a few moments later Neville's voice calmly said, "Somnium," and there was the thud of another of her soldiers falling over. and the force keeping her in the air diminished again. Hermione could feel the grab of the hover charms straining at her, but now it just wasn't enough. Her flight stopped, and she began falling in slow motion toward the ground, and she should have signaled her soldiers to just drop her. But she was too angry and confused, and not thinking fast enough, and still trying to muster the strength for one last stunning hex. And so there was nowhere to go when Harry pointed his wand at her and said, "Somnium." And that was the last word that Hermione Granger heard of her battle. 68. Self-Actualization, PT3. Hermione wasn't feeling very nice right now, or good either. There was a hot ball of anger burning inside her, and she wondered if this was something like Harry's darkness, though it probably wasn't even close, and she shouldn't have felt that way over some silly little game, but her whole army. 2 soldiers had beaten her whole army. That was what she'd been told after she woke up. It was a little too much. "Well," Professor Quirrell said. From up close, the defense professor didn't look quite as healthy as he had the last time she'd been in his office. His skin looked paler, and he moved a little slower. His expression was as stern as ever, and his gaze as penetrating. His fingers tapped sharply on his desk, rap-rap. "I would guess that of the 3 of you, only Mr. Malfoy has guessed why I've asked you here. Something to do with noble and most ancient houses," said Harry from beside her, sounding puzzled. "I didn't violate some kind of crazy law by firing on Daphne, did I?" "Not quite," the man said with heavy irony. "Since Miss Greengrass did not invoke the correct dueling forms, she is not entitled to demand that you be stripped of your house name. Although, of course, I would not have permitted a formal duel. Wars do not respect such rules." The defense professor leaned forward and rested his chin on steepled hands, as though sitting upright had already tired him. His eyes gazed at them, sharp and dangerous. "General Malfoy, why did I call you here? General Potter against the 2 of us isn't a fair fight anymore," Draco Malfoy said in a quiet voice. "What?" blurted Hermione. "We almost had them if Daphne hadn't fainted." "Miss Greengrass did not faint from magical exhaustion," Professor Quirrell said dryly. "Mr. Potter shot her in the back with a sleep hex while your soldiers were distracted by the sight of their general flying into a wall. But congratulations nonetheless, Miss Granger, on almost defeating 2 chaotic legionnaires with a mere 24 sunshine soldiers." The blood flaming in her cheeks grew a little hotter. That was just, if I'd only figured out he was wearing armor." Professor Quirrell gazed at her from over touched fingers. "Of course there are ways you could have won, Miss Granger. There always are, in every lost battle. The world around us redounds with opportunities, explodes with opportunities, which nearly all folk ignore because it would require them to violate a habit of thought. In every battle, 1,000 Hufflepuff bones waiting to be sharpened into spears. If you had thought to try a masked, finite incantatum on general principles, you would have dispelled Mr. Potter's suit of chainmail and everything else he was wearing except his underwear, which leads me to suspect that Mr. Potter did not quite realize his own vulnerability. Or you could have had your soldiers swarm Mr. Potter and Mr. Longbottom and physically wrest the wands from their hands." Mr. Malfoy's own response was not what I would term well-reasoned, but at least he did not wholly ignore his 1,000 alternatives. A sardonic smile. "But you, Miss Granger, had the misfortune to remember how to cast the stunning hex, and so you did not search your excellent memory for a dozen easier spells that might have proved efficacious. And you pinned all your army's hopes on your own person, so they lost spirit when you fell. Afterward, they continued to cast their futile sleep hexes, governed by the habits of fighting that had been trained into them, unable to break the pattern as Mr. Malfoy did. I cannot quite comprehend what goes through people's minds when they repeat the same failed strategy over and over, but apparently it is an astonishingly rare realization that you can try something else. And so the Sunshine Regiment was wiped out by 2 soldiers. The defense professor grinned mirthlessly. "One perceives certain similarities to how 50 Death Eaters dominated all of magical Britain, and how our much-loved ministry continues in its rule." The defense professor sighed. "Nonetheless, Miss Granger, the fact remains that this is not the first such defeat for you. In the previous battle, you and Mr. Malfoy united your forces, and yet you were fought to a standstill, so that you and Mr. Malfoy had to pursue Mr. Potter onto the roof." The Chaos Legion has now demonstrated, twice in succession, military strength equal to both other armies combined. This leaves me no choice. General Potter, you will select 8 soldiers from your army, including at least 1 chaotic lieutenant, to be divided among Dragon Army and the Sunshine Regiment. What? Hermione burst out again. She glanced over at the other generals and saw that Harry looked as shocked as her, while Draco Malfoy only looked resigned. General Potter is stronger than both of you together, Professor Quirrell said with calm precision. Your contest is over, he has won, and it is time to rebalance the 3 armies to present him with a renewed challenge. Professor Quirrell, said Harry. I didn't. This is my decision as the Professor of Battle Magic at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and it is not subject to negotiation. The words were still precise, but the look in Professor Quirrell's eyes chilled Hermione's blood, even though he was glaring at Harry and not at her. And I find it suspicious, Mr. Potter, that the moment you wished to isolate Miss Granger and Mr. Malfoy and force them to chase you onto the roof, you were able to annihilate just exactly as much of their united force as you pleased. Indeed, that is the level of performance I expected of you since the start of this year, and I am annoyed to discover that you have been holding back in my classes this entire time. I have seen what you can truly do, Mr. Potter. You are far beyond the point where Mr. Malfoy or Miss Granger can fight you on an equal level, and you will not be permitted to pretend otherwise. This, Mr. Potter, I tell you in my capacity as your professor. For you to learn to your full potential, you must exercise your full abilities and not hold back for any reason, particularly not childish frets over what your friends might think. She left the defense professor's office with a larger army and less dignity, and feeling a lot like a sad little bug that had just been squished, and trying very, very hard not to cry. I wasn't holding back, Harry said as soon as they turned the first corner away from Professor Quirrell's office, the moment the wooden door faded out of sight behind the stone walls. I wasn't pretending. I never let either of you win. She didn't answer, couldn't answer. It would all break loose if she tried to say a word. Really, said Draco Malfoy. The Dragon General still had that air of resignation. Because Quirrell's right. You know, it's suspicious that you could beat nearly everyone in both our armies as soon as you wanted to make us chase you onto the roof. And didn't you say something then, Potter, about us needing to beat you when you were fighting for real? The burning sensation was creeping up her throat, and when it reached her eyes, she would burst into tears, and from then on, she would be just a crying little girl to both of them. That, Harry's voice said urgently. She wasn't looking at him, but his voice sounded like he had his head turned toward her. That was, I tried a lot harder that time. There was an important reason. I had to, so I used a whole bunch of tricks I'd been saving up, and she'd always been trying her hardest, every time. And I let out a side of myself I wouldn't usually use for something like defense class. So if she ever got close to winning against Harry when it really mattered, he could just go into his dark side and crush her. Was that it? Of course it was. She couldn't even look Harry in the eyes when he was being scary. How had she ever thought she could beat him for real? Corridor forked, and Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy went left toward a staircase that climbed to the second floor, and she went right instead. She didn't even know where that passage went, but right now she'd rather be lost in the castle. Excuse me, Draco, said Harry's voice, and then there was a pattering of footsteps behind her. Leave me alone, she said. It came out sounding stern, but then she had to shut her mouth and press her lips together tightly and hold her breath to stop it all from coming out. That boy just kept on coming and ran around her and put himself in front of her, because he was stupid, that was why. And Harry said, his voice now a high and desperate whisper, I didn't run away when you were beating me in all my classes, except broomstick riding. He didn't understand, and he would never understand. Harry Potter would never understand, because no matter what contest he lost, he would still be the boy who lived. If you were Harry Potter and Hermione Granger was beating you, then it meant everyone was expecting you to rise to the challenge. If you were Hermione Granger and Harry Potter was beating you, that meant you were just no one. It's not fair, she said. Her voice was shaking, but she wasn't crying yet, not yet. I shouldn't have to fight your dark side. I'm only 12. That was what she thought then. I only used my dark side once, and that was when I had to. So today you beat my whole army being just Harry." She still wasn't crying yet, and she wondered what her face looked like right now, if she looked like an angry Hermione or a sad one. "I," Harry said. Voice got a little lower. "I wasn't really expecting to win that time. I know I said I was invincible, but that was just to try to scare you. I really just thought we'd slow you down for a bit." She started walking again, walked right past him, and as she passed Harry's face tightened up like he was going to cry. "Is Professor Quirrell right?" came a high, desperate whisper from behind her. "If I have you for a friend, will I always be afraid to do better because I know it will hurt your feelings?" "That's not fair, Hermione." She took a breath and held it and ran, her feet pattering across the stone as fast as they could, running as fast as she dared with her vision all blurry, ran so that no one would hear her, and this time Harry didn't follow. Minerva was going over the transfiguration parchment, due Monday, and had just marked down to negative 200 points a fifth-year parchment with an error that could have potentially killed someone. During her first year as a professor, she'd been indignant at the folly of older students. Now she was just resigned. Some people not only never learned, they never noticed that they were hopeless. They stayed bright and eager and kept on trying. Sometimes they believed you when you told them, before they left Hogwarts, that they must never try anything unusual, give up free transfiguration, and use the art only through established charms. And sometimes they didn't. She was in the middle of trying to unravel a particularly convoluted answer when a knock at the door disrupted her thoughts. And it wasn't her office hours, but it had only taken a very short time as head of Gryffindor House for her to learn to suspend judgment. You could always deduct house points afterward. "Come in," she said in a crisp voice. The young girl who entered her office had clearly been crying, and then afterward had washed her face in hopes it wouldn't show. "Miss Granger," said Professor McGonagall. It had taken her a moment to recognize that face with its eyes reddened and cheeks puffed. "What happened?" "Professor," said the young girl in a wavering voice, "you said that if I was ever worried or uncomfortable about anything, I should come to you at once." "Yes," said Professor McGonagall. "Now what happened?" The girl started to explain. Hermione stood still, and the stairs turned around her. A revolving helix that shouldn't have taken her anywhere at all, and instead bore her continuously upward. Hermione thought it seemed like the enchantment of the endless stair, which had been invented in 1733 by the wizard Aram Sabeti, who lived on top of Mount Everest in the days when no muggles could climb it. Only that couldn't be right because Hogwarts was much older. Maybe the enchantment had been reinvented. She should have been frightened, should have been nervous about her second meeting with the headmaster. She was, in fact, frightened and nervous about her second meeting with the headmaster. Only Hermione Granger had been thinking. She'd been thinking a lot, after she hadn't been able to run any further and had slid down against the wall with her lungs on fire, thinking while she curled up in a ball with her back against the chilly stone wall and her legs drawn up and crying. Even if she lost to Harry Potter, she was never, ever going to lose to Draco Malfoy. That was just totally, absolutely unacceptable. And Professor Quirrell had praised General Malfoy for not ignoring his 1,000 alternatives. And so, after Hermione had cried herself out, she'd thought of 14 other spells she should have tried against Harry and Neville. And then she'd started wondering if she might be making the same sort of mistake about other things. And that was how she'd ended up knocking on Professor McGonagall's door. Not asking for help. Right now Hermione didn't have any plans she could ask for help with, just telling Professor McGonagall everything, because when she'd thought of it, that had seemed like one of the 1,000 alternatives that Professor Quirrell had been talking about. And she told Professor McGonagall about how Harry Potter had changed since the day the phoenix had been on his shoulder, and about how people more and more seemed to see her as just something of Harry's, and how it seemed like Harry was pulling farther and farther away from everyone else in their school year, and went around with a sad air, sometimes like he was losing something, and she didn't know what to do anymore. And Professor McGonagall had told her that they needed to talk to the headmaster. And Hermione had felt worried, but then the thought had come to her that Harry Potter wouldn't have been scared of the headmaster. Harry Potter would have just barged ahead doing whatever he was trying to do. Maybe the thought had come to her. It was worth trying to be like that, not being scared, just doing whatever, and seeing what happened to her. It couldn't really be worse. The endless stair stopped turning, The great oaken door in front of them with the brass griffin knocker opened without being touched. Behind a black oaken desk, with dozens of drawers facing in every direction, looking like it had drawers set inside other drawers, was the silver-bearded headmaster of Hogwarts upon his throne, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, into whose gently twinkling eyes Hermione looked for around 3 seconds before she was distracted by all the other things in the room. Some time later, she wasn't sure how long, but it was while she was trying to count the number of things in the room for the 3rd time and still not getting the same answer, even though her memory insisted that nothing had been added or removed. The headmaster cleared his throat and said, "Miss Granger." Hermione's head snapped around, and she felt a little heat in her cheeks. But Dumbledore didn't appear annoyed with her at all, only serene, and with an inquiring look in those mild, half-glassed eyes. "Hermione," said Professor McGonagall. The older witch's voice was gentle, and a hand rested reassuringly on Hermione's shoulder. "Please tell the headmaster what you said to me about Harry." Hermione began speaking. Despite her newfound resolution, her voice still stumbled a little with nervousness, as she described how Harry had changed in the last few weeks since Fawkes had been on his shoulder. When she was done, there was a pause, and then the headmaster sighed. "I am sorry, Hermione Granger," said Dumbledore. Those blue eyes had grown sadder as she spoke. "That is unfortunate, but I cannot say it is unexpected. That is a hero's burden which you see." "A hero," said Hermione. She looked up nervously at Professor McGonagall and saw that the Transfiguration Professor's face had grown tight, though her hand still squeezed Hermione's shoulder reassuringly. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "I was a hero myself once, before I was a mysterious old wizard, in the days when I opposed Grindelwald. You have read history books, Miss Granger." Hermione nodded. "Well," said Dumbledore, "that is what heroes have to do, Miss Granger. They have their tasks, and they must grow strong to accomplish them, and that is what you see happening to Harry. If there is anything that can be done to gentle his pathway, then you will be the one to do it, and not I, for I am not Harry's friend, alas, but only his mysterious old wizard." "I," said Hermione. "I'm not sure I still want to be." Her voice stopped. It seemed too awful to say aloud. Dumbledore closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he looked a little older than before. "No one can stop you, Miss Granger, if you choose to stop being Harry's friend. As for what it would do to him, you may know that better than I. That doesn't seem fair," Hermione said, her voice trembling. "That I've got to be Harry's friend because he's got no one else. That doesn't seem fair. Being a friend is not something you can be forced to, Miss Granger." The blue eyes seemed to look right through her. "The feelings are there or they are not. If they are there, you can accept them or deny them. You are Harry's friend, and choosing to deny it would wound him terribly, perhaps beyond healing." "But Miss Granger, what would drive you to such extremes?" She couldn't find words. She'd never been able to find words. "If you get too near Harry, you get swallowed up, and no one sees you anymore. You're just something of his. Everyone thinks the whole world revolves around him, and—" She didn't have the words. The old wizard nodded slowly. "It is indeed an unjust world we live in, Miss Granger. All the world now knows that it is I who defeated Grindelwald, and fewer remember Elizabeth Beckett, who died opening the way so I could pass through. And yet she is remembered. Harry Potter is the hero of this play, Miss Granger. The world does revolve around him. He is destined for great things, and I ween that in time the name of Albus Dumbledore will be remembered as Harry Potter's mysterious old wizard, more than for anything else I have done. And perhaps the name of Hermione Granger will be remembered as his companion if you prove worthy of it in your day. For this I tell you true, never will you find more glory on your own than in Harry Potter's company." Hermione shook her head rapidly. "But that's not," she'd known she wouldn't be able to explain. "It's not about glory, it's about being something that belongs to someone else. So you think you would rather be the hero?" The old wizard sighed. "Miss Granger, I have been a hero and a leader, and I would have been 1,000 times happier if I could have belonged to someone like Harry Potter, someone made of sterner stuff than I, to make the hard decisions, and yet worthy to lead me. I thought once that I knew such a man, but I was mistaken. Miss Granger, you have no idea at all how fortunate are those like you, compared to heroes." The heart-burning feeling was creeping up her throat again. Along with helplessness, She didn't understand why Professor McGonagall had brought her here if the headmaster wasn't going to help. And from a glance at Professor McGonagall's face, it looked like Professor McGonagall also wasn't sure now that it had been a good idea. "I don't want to be a hero," said Hermione Granger. "I don't want to be a hero's companion. I just want to be me." The thought came to her a few seconds later that maybe she did in fact want to be a hero, but she decided not to change what she'd said. "Ah," said the old wizard. "That is a tall order, Miss Granger." Dumbledore rose from his throne, stepped out behind his desk, and pointed to a symbol on the wall, so ubiquitous that Hermione's eyes had glossed right over it. A faded shield on which was inscribed the heraldry of Hogwarts, the lion and snake, and badger and raven, and in Latin engraved words whose point she'd never understood. Then, as she realized where that shield was and how old it looked, it suddenly occurred to Hermione that this might be the original. "A Hufflepuff would say," said Dumbledore, tapping his finger on the faded badger and making Hermione wince for the sacrilege, "if it was the original, that people fail to become who they are meant to be because they are too lazy to put in all the work involved." Ravenclaw, tapping the raven, would repeat those words that the wise know to be far older than Socrates, "Know thyself," and say that people fail to become who they are meant to be through ignorance and lack of thought. And Salazar Slytherin, Dumbledore frowned as his finger tapped the faded snake. "Why, he said that we become who we are meant to be by following our desires wherever they lead." Perhaps he would say that people fail to become themselves because they refuse to do what is necessary to achieve their ambitions. But then one notes that nearly all of the dark wizards to come out of Hogwarts have been Slytherins. Did they become what they were meant to be? I think not. Dumbledore's finger tapped the lion, and then he turned toward her. "Tell me, Miss Granger, what would a Gryffindor say? I do not need to ask whether the Sorting Hat offered you that house. It didn't seem like a hard question. A Gryffindor would say that people don't become who they should be because they're afraid." "Most people are afraid, Miss Granger," said the old wizard. "They live their whole lives circumscribed by crippling fear that cuts off everything they might accomplish, everything they might become. Fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, fear of losing their mere possessions, fear of death, and above all the fear of what other people will think of them. Such fear is a most terrible thing, Miss Granger, and it is terribly important to know that. But it is not what Godric Gryffindor would have said. People become who they are meant to be, Miss Granger, by doing what is right." The old wizard's voice was gentle. "So tell me, Miss Granger, what seems to you like the right choice? For that is who you truly are, and wherever that path leads, that is who you are meant to become." There was a long space filled with the sounds of things that could not be counted. She thought about it because she was a Ravenclaw. "I don't think it's right," Hermione said slowly, "for someone to have to live inside someone else's shadow like that." "Many things in the world are not right," said the old wizard. "The question is what is right for you to do about them. Hermione Granger, I shall be less subtle than is usual for a mysterious old wizard, and tell you outright that you cannot imagine how badly things could go if the events surrounding Harry Potter turned to ill. His quest is a matter you would not even dream of walking away from if you knew." "What quest?" said Hermione. Her voice was trembling because it was very clear what answer the headmaster was looking for and she didn't want to give it. "What happened to Harry back then? Why was Fox on his shoulder?" "He grew up," said the old wizard. His eyes blinked several times beneath the half-moon glasses, and his face suddenly looked very lined. "You see, Miss Granger, people do not grow up because of time. People grow up when they are placed in grown-up situations. That is what happened to Harry Potter that Saturday. He was told, 'You are not to share this information with anyone, you understand?' He was told that he would have to fight someone. I cannot tell you who. I cannot tell you why, but that is what happened to him and why he needs his friends." There was a pause. "Bellatrix Black," Hermione said. She couldn't have been more shocked if someone had plugged an electrical cord into her ear. "You're going to make Harry fight Bellatrix Black?" "No," said the old wizard. "Not her. I cannot tell you who or why." She thought about it some more. "Is there any way I can keep up with Harry?" said Hermione. "I mean, I'm not saying it's what I'll do, but if he needs friends, then can we be equal friends? Can I be a hero too?" "Ah," said the old wizard and smiled. "Only you can decide that, Miss Granger. But you're not going to help me like you're helping Harry." The old wizard shook his head. I have helped him little enough, Miss Granger, and if you are asking me for a quest, the old wizard smiled again rather wryly. Miss Granger, you are in your first year of Hogwarts. Do not be too eager to grow up. There will be time enough for that later. I'm 12. Harry's 11. Harry Potter is special, said the old wizard. As you know, Miss Granger. The blue eyes were suddenly piercing beneath the half-moon glasses, and she was reminded of the day of the Dementor when Dumbledore's voice had said, inside her mind, that he knew about Harry's dark side. Hermione put up her hand and touched Professor McGonagall's hand, which had stayed strong on her shoulder this whole time, and Hermione said, she was surprised that her voice didn't break, "I'd like to go now, please." "Of course," said Professor McGonagall, and Hermione felt the hand on her shoulder gently turning her around to face the oaken door. "Have you chosen your path yet, Hermione Granger?" said Albus Dumbledore's voice from behind her, even as the door slowly creaked open to reveal the enchantment of the endless stair. She nodded. "And I'll," she said, her voice stuck. I'll, she swallowed. "I'll do what's right." She didn't say anything else. She couldn't. And then the endless stair began revolving around her once again. Neither she nor Professor McGonagall spoke on the way down. When the flowing stone gargoyles stepped out of their way, and the two of them stepped out into the corridors of Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall finally spoke, and she said in a whisper, "I'm so terribly sorry, Miss Granger. I did not think the headmaster would say such things to you. I think he truly has forgotten what it is like to be a child." Hermione glanced back up to her and saw that Professor McGonagall looked like she was about to burst into tears. Only not really, but there was a tightness in her face that was like that. "If I want to be a hero too," said Hermione, "if I've decided to be a hero too, is there anything you can do to help?" Professor McGonagall rapidly shook her head and said, "Miss Granger, I'm not sure the headmaster is wrong about that." "You are 12. "Okay," said Hermione. They walked forward a bit. "Excuse me," said Hermione. "Is it okay if I walk back to the Ravenclaw Tower by myself? I'm sorry, it's not your fault or anything. I just want to be by myself right now." "Of course, Miss Granger," said Professor McGonagall, her voice sounding a little hoarse, and Hermione heard her footsteps stop and then turn around behind her. Hermione Granger walked away. She climbed a flight of stairs, and then another, wondering if there was anyone else in Hogwarts who would give her a chance to be a hero. Professor Flitwick would say the same thing as Professor McGonagall, and even if he didn't, he probably couldn't help. Hermione didn't know who could help. Well, Professor Quirrell would come up with something clever if she used up enough Quirrell points, but she had a feeling that asking him would be a bad idea, that the defense professor couldn't help anyone become the sort of hero that was worth becoming, and that he wouldn't even understand the difference. She had almost gotten to the Ravenclaw Tower when she saw the flash of gold. 69. Self-actualization, PT4. It was out of the corner of her eye that Hermione Granger saw it, a reflection on the polished metal of a statue at the junction of two corridors, a flash of gold, a flash of red, something like an image of fire. Just for a moment she saw it, and then it was gone. She paused, puzzled, and she almost walked away, but there had been something familiar about that brief glow. Hermione walked forward to where the statue had stood, looked at the corridor from which she thought the fiery reflection might have come. Faintly, as though from a faraway place, she heard the cry, the call. Hermione started to run. She ran for a while. Whenever she got to a junction, she would pause, catch as much breath as she could, and then she would see a flash of fire reflected from one direction or another, or hear that distant call. If it hadn't been for her army training, she would have fallen over in exhaustion, running like that. She never saw the phoenix. And then she came to a four-way branch, and there was nothing, no sign. She waited for long seconds, and she heard no cry and saw no fire. And she was only just starting to wonder with a sick, sad feeling if she'd imagined the whole thing when she heard a person cry out. When her rapidly racing feet turned the corner, her mind took in the whole scene at a glance. Three huge boys in green-trimmed robes already turning to look at her, and one shorter and smaller boy in yellow, who was dangling in the air from one foot held up high by an invisible hand. The Sunshine General didn't even think about it. People who stopped to think didn't spring very good ambushes. Her wand was in her hand. Her fingers did the twist, and her lips said, "Somnium." And the largest bully fell over. The Hufflepuff boy dropped out of the air with a thump, and the other two bullies were trying to aim their wands at her, and she said, "Somnium." Again, and another huge boy keeled over, the one who'd been aiming his wand faster. That was who she'd fired at. Unfortunately casting two sleep hexes in a row that was hard even for her, and she couldn't get off a third before the last bully shouted Pratigo, and was surrounded by a shimmering blue glow. 24 hours ago, Hermione would have panicked at that. A real shielding charm would let the bully boy cast spells on her even while he was protected. Now she, stupefy, shouted the bully boy. The crimson bolt blasted toward her with a terrible brilliance, blazing far brighter than any hex that had sprung from Harry's wand. Hermione swayed slightly to the left, and the bolt missed, because the bully's aim hadn't been nearly as good as Harry's, and the thought came to her that maybe bullies and Professor Quirrell's armies didn't mix. "Stupefy," shouted the bully boy again. "Expelliarmus, stupefy." Anyway, now she just spent a whole hour thinking of all the other spells she could have cast on Harry and Neville. "Jellify," yelled the bully boy, a wide-beam jinx with no visible bolt to dodge, and her knees suddenly felt almost too weak to support her. And then, with an angry roar producing an even brighter blaze of crimson, "Stupefy." She dodged that one by deliberately falling, and by then she'd recovered enough for her next spell, which was "Glissio," said Hermione, directing her remark to the floor. "Oof," said the bully boy as his feet went out from under him, and he actually dropped his wand. The Pratigo winked out. "Somnium," said Hermione. She was still breathing in gasps as she crawled over to where the Hufflepuff boy was sitting up and groaning and rubbing his skull where he'd been dropped headfirst into the floor. It was a good thing he hadn't been a muggle, Hermione realized, or he might have snapped his neck. She hadn't actually thought of that. "Ah," said the boy. His hair was of a color that would have been called brunette if he was a girl, his eyes an undistinguished brown that somehow seemed just right for Hufflepuff. There weren't any tears on his face, but he looked sort of pale. She pegged him at about fourth year or third. Then the brown eyes widened as he focused on her. "General Sunshine." "Yeah," she said. "That's," gasped me. If the Hufflepuff boy said anything about her being Harry Potter's love interest, she decided he was going to die. "Wow," said the Hufflepuff boy. "That was you just, I mean I saw you on the screens before Christmas, but wow, I can't believe you just did that." There was a pause. "I can't believe I just did that," thought Hermione Granger, who was feeling a little faint all of a sudden. It must have been all that running. "Excuse," gasped me, she said. "Can you gasp, ungellify my legs?" The boy nodded, pushed himself to his feet, and reached inside his robes for his wand. But Hermione had to correct his gesture before the counterjinx worked right. "I'm Michael Hopkins," said the boy once Hermione had rolled back to her own feet. He stuck out his hand. "Or just Mike inside Hufflepuff. There aren't any other Mikes in all of Hufflepuff this year, would you believe it?" They shook hands, and Mike said, "Anyway, thank you." Hermione wasn't prepared for the rush of euphoria that hit her then. Saving someone like that literally felt better than anything she'd ever felt in her whole life. She turned to look at the bullies. They were very big, and they looked, she thought, around 15 years old, and she was suddenly realizing just how large a difference had sprung up between Hogwarts students who'd signed up for all of Professor Quirrell's extracurricular activities, and students who'd had years of being taught by the worst professors ever to go professing. Being able to hit things that you aimed at, for example, or being able to think well enough in the middle of a fight to realize that you ought to enervate your fallen allies. And other things Professor Quirrell had said, like that in the real world almost any fight would be settled by a surprise attack, suddenly made a lot more sense to her. Still trying to catch her breath, she looked back at Mike. "Would you believe," said Hermione Granger, "that 5 minutes ago I was having trouble figuring out how to become a hero?" Had she really thought she needed permission from someone, or that heroes sat around waiting for someone else to give them quests? It was very simple, actually. You just went where the evil was. That was all it ever took to be a hero. She should have remembered. She shouldn't have needed a phoenix to tell her that bad things sometimes happened right here in Hogwarts. Then Hermione glanced nervously back at where the three older boys were lying unconscious as the realization hit that they'd seen her. They might know who she was. They might sneak up on her and take her by surprise. And they could really hurt her. Hermione stopped. She remembered that Harry Potter had put himself in the middle of 5 Slytherin bullies on the first day of class when he hadn't even known how to use his wand. She remembered the headmaster saying that you grew up by being put in grown-up situations, and that most people lived their lives inside a constraining circle of fear. And she remembered Professor McGonagall's voice saying, "You are 12." Hermione took a deep breath, once, twice, and 3 times. She asked Mike if he needed to go to Madame Pomfrey's office, which he didn't, and got him to tell her the names of the Slytherin boys, just in case. And then Hermione Granger strolled away from the heap of unconscious bullies, making sure to put a smile on her face as she walked. She knew that she was probably going to get hurt sooner or later. But if you were too scared of getting hurt to do what was right, then you couldn't be a hero. It was as simple as that. And if you put the sorting hat on her head at that moment, it wouldn't have waited even 1 second before calling out, "Gryffindor." She was still thinking about it when she came down to dinner. The euphoria of saving someone still hadn't worn off, and she was beginning to worry that it had broken something in her brain. As she approached the Ravenclaw table, a sudden epidemic of whispers broke out, and Hermione wondered if the Hufflepuff boy had said anything yet, before she realized that the whispers probably weren't about that. She sat down across from Harry Potter, who looked extremely nervous, probably because she was still smiling. "Ah," said Harry, as she served herself freshly toasted bread, butter, cinnamon, no fruits or vegetables whatsoever, and 3 helpings of chocolate brownies. "Ah," she let him go on like that until she'd finished pouring herself a glass of grapefruit juice, and then she said, "I've got a question for you, Mr. Potter. How do you think people fail to become themselves?" "What?" said Harry. She looked at him. "Pretend there isn't all this stuff going on," she said, "and just say whatever you'd have said yesterday." Harry said, looking very confused and worried. "I think we already are ourselves. It's not like I'm an imperfect copy of someone else. But I guess if I try to run with the sense of the question, then I'd say that people don't become themselves because we absorb all this crazy stuff from the environment and then regurgitate it. I mean, how many people playing Quidditch would be playing a game like that if they'd invented the game themselves? Or back in Muggle Britain, how many people who think of themselves as Labour or Conservative or Liberal Democrat would invent that exact bundle of political beliefs if they had to come up with everything themselves? Hermione considered this. She'd been wondering if Harry would say something Slytherin or maybe even Gryffindor, but this didn't seem to fit into the headmaster's list, and it occurred to Hermione that there might be a lot more viewpoints on the subject than just 4. "Okay," said Hermione. "Different question. What makes someone a hero?" "A hero," said Harry. "Yeah," said Hermione. "Ah," Harry said. His fork and knife nervously sawed at a piece of steak, cutting it into tinier and tinier pieces. "I think a lot of people can do things when the world channels them into it. Like people are expecting you to do it, or it only uses skills you already know, or there's an authority watching to catch your mistakes and make sure you do your part. But problems like that are probably already being solved, and then there's no need for heroes. So I think the people we call heroes are rare because they've got to make everything up as they go along, and most people aren't comfortable with that." "Why do you ask?" Harry's fork stabbed 3 pieces of thoroughly shredded steak and lifted them up to his mouth. "Oh, I just stunned 3 older Slytherin bullies and rescued a Hufflepuff," said Hermione. "I'm going to be a hero." When Harry had finished choking on his food, some of the other Ravenclaws in hearing distance were still coughing. He said, "What?" Hermione told the story. It began rippling out in further whispers even as she spoke, though she left out the part about the phoenix, because that seemed like a private thing between the 2 of them. Hermione had felt surprised, thinking about it afterward, that a phoenix would appear for someone who wanted to be a hero. It seemed a bit selfish when she thought about it that way, but maybe it didn't matter to phoenixes so long as they saw that you were willing to help people. When she was done talking, Harry stared at her across the table and didn't say a word. "I'm sorry for how I acted earlier," Hermione said. She sipped from her glass of grapefruit juice. "I should have remembered that if I'm still beating the pants off you in Charms class, then it's okay for you to do better in defense. Please don't take this the wrong way," said Harry. He looked too adult now and grim. "But are you sure this is who you are, and not, to put it bluntly, me?" "I'm quite certain," said Hermione. "Why, my name practically spells out heroine, except for the extrum. I never noticed that until today." "Being a hero isn't all fun and games," said Harry. Not real heroing, the sort grown-ups have to do. It isn't like this. It isn't going to be this easy. I know, said Hermione. It's hard and it's painful and you've got to make decisions where there isn't any good answer. Yes, Harry, I read those books too. No, said Harry. You don't understand. Even if the books warn you, there's no way you can understand until— That doesn't stop you, said Hermione. It doesn't stop you even a little. I bet you never even considered not being a hero because of that. So why do you think it'll stop me? There was a pause. A sudden huge smile lit Harry's face, a smile that was as bright and as boyish as the frown had been grim and adult, and everything was all right again between them. This is going to go horribly, mind-bogglingly wrong somehow, said Harry, still smiling hugely. You know that, right? Oh, I know, said Hermione. She ate another bite of toast. That reminds me, Dumbledore refused to be my mysterious old wizard. Is there some place I can write to get another one? Aftermath. And Professor Flitwick says her determination seems unshakable, Minerva said tightly, staring at the silver-bearded old wizard who was responsible for this. Albus Dumbledore was just sitting silently and listening to her with a distant, sad look in his eyes. Miss Granger didn't even blink when Professor Flitwick threatened to have her transferred to Gryffindor, just said that if she left, she would take all the books with her. Hermione Granger has decided she's going to be a hero, and she's not taking no for an answer. I doubt you could have pushed her into this any harder if you had tried to. It took all of 5 full seconds for Minerva's brain to process the realization. Albus, she shrieked. My dear, said the old wizard, after you have dealt with your 30th hero or so, you will realize that they react quite predictably to certain things, such as being told that they are too young, or that they are not destined to be heroes, or that being a hero is unpleasant. And if you truly wish to be sure, you should tell them all 3. Although, with a brief sigh, it does not do to be too blatant, or your deputy headmistress might catch you. Albus, Minerva said, her voice even tighter, if she is hurt, I swear this time She would have come to that same place in due time, Albus said, the distant sad look still in his eyes. If someone is meant to become a hero, then they will not listen to our warnings, Minerva, no matter how hard we try. And given that, it is better for Harry if Miss Granger does not fall too far behind him. Albus produced, as though from nowhere, a tin which flipped open to reveal small yellow lumps. She'd never been able to figure out where he kept it, and she'd never been able to detect the magic involved. Lemon drop. She is a 12-year-old girl, Albus. Aftermath. Within the windows, barely visible in the evening gloom, fishes swam in the black waters, illuminated by the bright shine of the Slytherin common room as they came closer, fading into darkness as they swam away. Daphne Greengrass was sitting in a comfortable black leather couch, her head collapsed into her hands, glowing golden yellowish, as bright sparks of white light winked in and out of existence around her. She'd been ready to be teased about liking Neville Longbottom. She'd been expecting to hear a lot of snide remarks about Hufflepuffs. She'd thought of whole reams of snappy comebacks for it while she was on the way back to the Slytherin dungeons. She'd been looking forward to being teased about liking Neville. Being teased about that sort of thing meant you'd grown up into a real girl. As it turned out, nobody had worked out that her challenging Neville to most ancient duel meant that she liked him. She'd thought it would be obvious, but no, nobody else had even thought of that, apparently. It was always the hex you didn't see that hit you. She should have just called herself Daphne of Sunshine, like Neville of Chaos, or Sunny Daphne like Sunny Ron, or anything except Greengrass of Sunshine. Greengrass of Sunshine. It had gone from there to Greengrass of Sunshine and blue skies. Then someone had added snow-topped mountains and frolicking woodland creatures. Currently, she was being referred to as the sparkly unicorn princess of the noble and most ancient house of Sparklepoo. And some cursed 6th-year girl had hit her with a sparkling jinx. She hadn't even known there was such a thing as a sparkling jinx, and finite incantatum hadn't worked. And she'd asked older girls who she'd thought were her friends. She had apparently been wrong about this. And then she'd threatened the caster with grievous political mayhem wreaked by her father, and nonetheless Daphne Greengrass was still sitting in the Slytherin common room with her head in her hands, sparkling brightly and wondering how she'd ended up as the only sane person in Hogwarts. It was after dinner time and they were still at it, and if they didn't stop by tomorrow morning, she was going to transfer to Durmstrang and become the next Dark Lady. Hey, everyone, said the Carrow twins dramatically, waving an issue of the Daily Prophet. "Did you hear the news? The Wisengamot just ruled that 'let's see what you got' constitutes a lawful challenge to be fought until the challenger lies down and has a nap." "How dare you insult the honor of the sparkly unicorn princess?" shouted Tracy. "Let's see what you got." Then Tracy lay down flat on a sofa and started snoring loudly. Daphne's sparkling head sank further into her glowing hands. "After my family takes over, I'm going to have you all put under anti-apparition jinxes and flued into the sea," she said to no one in particular. "You're all okay with that, right?" Thunk, 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 thunk. Daphne looked up, surprised. That was a sunshine code signal. "I hate someone knocking," bellowed Mr. Goyle. "Knocking of the door. Let's see what you've got, door," shouted an older boy near the door and yanked the door open. There was a moment of complete surprise. "I've come to have a word with Miss Greengrass," said the Sunshine General, sounding like she was trying to sound confident. "Could someone please?" From the look on Hermione's face, she had just noticed Daphne sparkling. And that was when Millicent Bulstrode raced up from the lower dorms and shouted, "Hey, everyone, guess what? Now Granger went and beat up Derek and what's left of his crew, and his father owled him and said that if he didn't, Millicent caught sight of Hermione standing in the doorway." There was a very loud silence. "Ah," said Daphne. "What?" said her brain. "Ah, what are you doing here, General?" "Well," said Hermione Granger with a strange smile on her face, "I've decided it's not fair if mysterious old wizards give some people a chance to be heroes and not others. And also I've read history books, and there aren't nearly enough girl heroes in them. So I thought I'd just drop by and see if you wanted to be a hero, and why are you glowing like that?" There was another silence. "This," said Daphne, "was probably not the best time to ask me that question. I'll take it," shouted Tracy Davis, leaping off her sofa. And thus was born the Society for the Promotion of Heroic Equality for Witches. 70. Self-Actualization, PT 5. Even if you had been the deputy headmistress for 3 decades, and a transfiguration professor before that, it was rare that you saw Albus Dumbledore caught completely flat-footed. Susan Bones, Lavender Brown, and Daphne Greengrass, Minerva finished. "I should also note, Albus, that Miss Granger's account of your seemingly unsupportive attitude, I believe her phrase was, he said, 'I should be happy to be just a sidekick,' has generated a good deal of interest among the older girls, several of whom came to me to ask if Miss Granger's accusations were true, since Miss Granger had said that I was there." The old wizard leaned back in his huge chair, still gazing at her, his eyes looking rather abstracted beneath the half-moon glasses. "It placed me in something of a dilemma, Albus," said Professor McGonagall. Her face stayed quite neutral. She made sure of that. "I now know that you did not truly mean to discourage the girl. Quite the opposite, in fact. But you and Severus have often told me that to keep a secret I must give no sign that differs from the reaction of someone truly ignorant. Thus I had no choice but to confirm that Miss Granger's account was accurate and feign the appropriate degree of worry with a slight overtone of offense. After all, had I not known you were deliberately manipulating Miss Granger, I might have been rather put out." "I see," the old wizard said slowly. His hands toyed absently with his silver beard, small, quick gestures. "Thankfully," Professor McGonagall continued, "so far Professors Sinister and Vector are the only 2 faculty members to don Miss Granger's buttons." "Buttons," repeated the old wizard. Minerva drew forth a small silver disc bearing the initials SPHEW, laid it on Albus's desk, and gave it a brief tap with her finger. And the voices of Hermione Granger, Padma Patil, Parvati Patil, Lavender Brown, Susan Bones, Hannah Abbott, Daphne Greengrass, and Tracy Davis cried out in unison, "We won't settle for second best. It's time to give a witch a quest. Miss Granger is selling them for 2 sickles, and tells me that she has so far sold 50 of them. I believe that Nymphadora Tonks in 7th year Hufflepuff is enchanting them for her." "To conclude my report," Professor McGonagall said briskly, "our 8 newly minted heroines have asked permission to conduct a protest outside the entrance to your office." "I hope," Albus said, frowning, "you explained to them that I explained to them that Wednesday at 7 p.m. would be fine," said Minerva. She took back the button from the headmaster's desk, favored Albus with a honeyed smile, and turned to the door. "Minerva," said the old wizard from behind her. "Minerva." The oaken door shut solidly behind her. There wasn't a lot of room between the brief stone walls that demarcated the vestibule to the headmaster's office. So although a lot of people had wanted to watch the protest, not many had been allowed to come. Just Professor Sinistra and Professor Vector, who were wearing the buttons, and the prefects Penelope Clearwater and Rose Brown and Jacqueline Priest, who were wearing the buttons. Behind them, Professor McGonagall and Professor Sprout and Professor Flitwick, who weren't wearing the buttons, scrutinizing the whole affair. Harry Potter and the head boy of Hogwarts were there, and the boy prefects Percy Weasley and Oliver Beatson, all wearing the buttons to show solidarity. And of course the 8 founding members of SPHEW, forming a picket line next to the gargoyles with their signs. Hermione's own sign, attached to a solid wooden handle which seemed to weigh heavier and heavier in her hands as the seconds passed, said nobody's sidekick. And Professor Quirrell, who was leaning with his back against the far stone wall and watching with unreadable eyes. The defense professor had gotten one of her buttons, though she'd never sold one to him, and he wasn't wearing it, but idly tossing it with one hand. This whole idea had seemed like a much better idea 4 days ago, when the fires of her indignation had been burning fresh and hot, and she'd been facing the prospect of doing it all 4 days later instead of right now. But she had to carry on, because that was what heroes did. They carried on, and also because it had seemed infinitely too awful to tell everyone she was calling it off. Hermione wondered how much heroism had gone on for reasons like that. Most books didn't say, and then they refused to give up, no matter how sensible it would have been, because that would have been too embarrassing. But a great deal of history made a lot more sense that way. At 7:15 p.m., Professor McGonagall had told her Headmaster Dumbledore would come down and talk to them for a couple of minutes. Professor McGonagall had said not to be frightened. The headmaster was a good person deep down, and they'd properly gotten the school's authorization for the protest. But Hermione was very, very aware that even if she was doing it with signed permission, she was still defying authority. After she decided to be a hero, Hermione had done the obvious thing and gone to the Hogwarts library and taken out books on how to be a hero. Then she'd returned those books back to their shelves, because it had been patently obvious that none of the authors had been actual heroes themselves. Instead, she'd just read 5 times over, until she'd memorized every word, the 30 Inches by Godric Gryffindor that was all his autobiography and his life's advice. Or the English translation, anyway. She couldn't read Latin yet. Godric Gryffindor's autobiography had been a lot more compressed than the books Hermione was used to reading. He used one sentence to say things that should have taken 30 inches just by themselves, and then there was another sentence after that. But it was clear from what she'd read that, while defying authority wasn't the point of being a hero, you couldn't be a hero if you were too scared to do it. And Hermione Granger knew by now how others saw her, and she knew what other people thought she couldn't do. Hermione hefted her picket sign a little higher and concentrated on breathing slowly and rhythmically instead of hyperventilating until she fell over. "Really?" said Miss Priest in a tone of undisguised fascination. "They couldn't vote." "Indeed," said Professor Sinistra. The astronomy professor's hair was still dark, and her dark face only slightly lined. Hermione would have guessed her age at around 70, except I quite remember my mother's rejoicing when they announced the Qualification of Women Act, although she did not actually qualify, which meant that Professor Sinistra had been around her Muggle family in 1918. And that wasn't the worst of it. Just a few centuries earlier, 30 seconds later, all the non-Muggle-borns, male and female both, were staring at Professor Sinistra with utterly shocked expressions. Hannah had dropped her sign. And that wasn't the worst of it either, not by half, finished Professor Sinistra. But you see where this sort of thing could potentially lead. "Merlin preserve us," said Penelope Clearwater in a strangled voice. "You mean that's how men would treat us if we didn't have wands to defend ourselves?" "Hey," said one of the boy prefects. "That's not." There was a short, sardonic laugh from the direction of Professor Quirrell. When Hermione turned her head to look, she saw that the defense professor was still idly toying with the button, not bothering to glance up at the rest of them as he said, "Such is human nature, Miss Clearwater. Rest assured that you would be no kinder if witches had wands and men lacked them." "I hardly think so," snapped Professor Sinistra, a cold chuckle. I suspect it happens more often than any dare suggest in the proudest pureblood families. Some lonely witch spies a handsome muggle and thinks how very easy it would be to slip the man a love potion and by him be adored alone and utterly. And since she knows he can offer her no resistance, why, it is only natural for her to take from him whatever she pleases, Professor Quirrell, said Professor McGonagall sharply. I'm sorry, Professor Quirrell said mildly, his eyes still looking down on the button in his hand. Are we all still pretending it doesn't happen? My apologies, then. Professor Sinistra snapped, and I suppose that wizards don't. There are children present, professors. Again, Professor McGonagall. Some do, Professor Quirrell said equably, as though discussing the weather. Although personally, I don't. There was a bit of silence for a time. Hermione put up her sign again. It had slipped down to her shoulder while she was listening. She'd never thought of that, not even a little, and now she was trying not to think of it, and her stomach was feeling a bit queasy. She looked in Harry Potter's direction, not quite knowing why she did, and she saw that Harry's face was perfectly still. A chill ran down her spine before she looked away, not quite fast enough to miss the small nod that Harry gave her, as though they were agreeing on something. To be fair, Professor Sinistra said after a while, since I received my Hogwarts letter, I can't recall encountering any prejudice on account of being a woman or colored. No, now it is all for being a muggle-born. I believe Miss Granger said that it was just with heroes that she found a problem so far. It took Hermione a moment to recognize that she'd been asked the question, and then she said, yes, in a tone that squeaked a little. This whole thing had blown up a bit larger than she'd imagined when she'd started it. What exactly did you check, Miss Granger? Said Professor Vector. She looked older than Professor Sinistra, her hair starting to grey a little. Hermione hadn't ever come close to Professor Vector in person until the arithmancy professor had asked her for a button. Hermione said, her voice a little high. I checked the history books, and there's been as many woman ministers of magic as men. Then I looked at supreme mugwumps, and there were a few more wizards than witches, but not many. But if you look at people like famous dark wizard hunters, or people who have stopped invasions of dark creatures, or people who have overthrown dark lords, and the dark wizards themselves, of course, said Professor Quirrell. Now the defense professor had looked up. You may add that to your list, Miss Granger. Among all the suspected Death Eaters, we know of only two sorceresses, Bellatrix Black and Alecto Carrow, and I dare say that most wizards would be hard-pressed to name a single dark lady besides Baba Yaga. Hermione just stared at him. He couldn't possibly be Professor Quirrell, said Professor Vector. What exactly are you implying? The defense professor raised the button so that the golden-lettered SPHEW faced them and said, Heroes, then turned the button to show its silver backside and said, Dark Wizards. They are similar career paths followed by similar people, and one can hardly ask why young witches are turning away from one course without considering its reflection. Oh, now I see, said Tracy Davis, speaking up so suddenly that Hermione gave a small startle. You're joining our protest because you're worried that not enough girls are becoming dark witches. Then Tracy giggled, which Hermione couldn't have managed at this point if you paid her £1,000,000 sterling. There was a half-smile on Professor Quirrell's face as he replied, Not really, Miss Davis. In truth, I do not care about that sort of thing in the slightest. But it is futile to count the witches among ministers of magic and other such ordinary folk leading ordinary existences, when Grindelwald and Dumbledore and he who must not be named were all men. The defense professor's fingers idly spun the button, turning it over and over. Then again, only a very few folk ever do anything interesting with their lives. What does it matter to you if they are mostly witches or mostly wizards, so long as you are not among them? And I suspect you will not be among them, Miss Davis, for although you are ambitious, you have no ambition. That's not true, said Tracy indignantly. And what's it mean? Professor Quirrell straightened from where he had been leaning against the wall. You were sorted into Slytherin, Miss Davis, and I expect that you will grasp at any opportunity for advancement which falls into your hands. But there is no great ambition that you are driven to accomplish, and you will not make your opportunities. At best, you will grasp your way upward into Minister of Magic, or some other high position of unimportance, never breaking the bounds of your existence. Then Professor Quirrell's gaze shifted away from Tracy. He was looking at her, the pale blue eyes staring at her with an awful intensity. "Tell me, Miss Granger, do you have an ambition?" "Professor," squeaked the high, stern voice of Professor Flitwick, and then her head of house's voice cut off, and from the side of her vision, Hermione saw that Harry had laid his hand on Professor Flitwick's shoulder and was shaking his head, face looking very adult. Hermione felt like a deer caught in headlights. "What drove you to break your bounds, Miss Granger?" said the defense professor, still gazing directly at her. "Why is getting good marks in class no longer enough? Is it true greatness that you seek? Does some aspect of the world dissatisfy you that you must remake according to your will, or is this all merely a child's game to you? I will be quite disappointed if this is only about rivaling Harry Potter." "Aye," said Hermione, her voice so high-pitched it made a sort of peeping sound, but then she couldn't think of what else to say. "You may take a moment to think if you like," said Professor Quirrell. "Pretend it is a homework essay, 6 inches due Thursday. I hear you are quite eloquent in them." Everyone was looking at her. "Aye," said Hermione. "I don't agree with one single thing you just said anywhere." "Well spoken," came Professor McGonagall's crisp voice. Professor Quirrell's gaze did not waver. "That is not 6 inches, Miss Granger. Something drives you to defy the headmaster's verdict and gather followers about yourself. Perhaps it is something you prefer not to speak aloud." Hermione knew the correct answer wouldn't impress Professor Quirrell, but it was the correct answer, so she said it. "I don't think you need ambition to be a hero," Hermione said. Her voice wavered, but it didn't crack. "I think you just have to do what's right. And they're not my followers, we're friends." Professor Quirrell leaned back against the wall again. The half-smile had faded from his face. "Most folk tell themselves they are doing right, Miss Granger. They do not thereby rise above the ordinary." Hermione took a couple of deep breaths, trying to be brave. "It's not about being not ordinary," she said as stoutly as she could. "But I think if someone just tries to do what's right, over and over again, and they're not too lazy to do all the work it takes, and they think about what they're doing, and they're brave enough to do it even when they're scared." Hermione paused for an instant, her eyes darting to Tracy and Daphne. "And they cleverly plan how to do it, and they don't just do what other people do. Then I think someone like that would already get into enough trouble." Some of the girls and boys chuckled, as did Professor McGonagall, who looked wry and proud at the same time. "You may be right about that," said the defense professor, his eyes half-lidded. He tossed Hermione the button, and she caught it without thinking. "My donation to your cause, Miss Granger. I understand that they are worth 2 sickles." The defense professor turned and walked away without another word. "I thought I was going to faint," gasped Hannah after his footsteps had faded, and she heard some of the other girls letting out their breath or putting down their signs for a moment. "I do too have an ambition," said Tracy, who seemed to be almost on the verge of tears. I'll figure out what it is by tomorrow, but I have one, I'm sure." "If you really can't think of anything," Daphne said, giving Tracy a comforting pat on the shoulder, "just go with the oldie but goodie and try to take over the world." "Hey," said Susan sharply. "You're supposed to be heroes now. That means you have to be good." "No, it's all right," said Lavender. "I'm pretty sure General Chaos wants to take over the world, and he's sort of a good guy." More conversation was going on behind the picket line. "My goodness," said Penelope Clearwater. "I think that's the most overtly evil defense professor we've ever had." Professor McGonagall coughed warningly, and the head boy said, "You weren't around for Professor Barney," which made several people twitch. "Professor Quirrell just talks like that," said Harry Potter, though he sounded less certain than before. "I mean, think about it. He doesn't do anything like what Professor Snape does, Mr. Potter," squeaked Professor Flitwick, voice polite and face stern. "Why did you ask me to stay silent?" Professor Quirrell was testing Hermione to see if he wanted to be her mysterious old wizard, Harry said, which totally would not have worked out in any way, shape, or form, but she had to answer for herself. Hermione blinked. Then Hermione blinked again, as she realized that it was Professor Quirrell who was Harry Potter's mysterious old wizard, and not Dumbledore at all, and that really wasn't a good sign. A rumbling noise filled the small stone vestibule, and Hermione, her nerves already on edge, spun rapidly around, almost dropping her protest sign as her other hand darted toward her wand. The gargoyles were stepping aside, the flowing stone rumbling like rock as it moved like flesh. The huge, ugly figures waited only briefly, dead grey eyes staring out in silent vigil. Then the great gargoyles folded their wings back into place and stepped back into their former positions, the flowing stone not changing its outward appearance at all as it returned from flexibility to motionlessness, and the brief gap in the stone of Hogwarts was solid once more. And before them all, wearing robes of bright purple that probably only looked hideous if you were Muggle-born, stood the towering form of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, the chief warlock of the Wisengamot, the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, the vanquisher of the Dark Lord Grindelwald and protector of Britain, the rediscoverer of the fabled 12 uses of dragon's blood, the most powerful wizard alive. And he was looking at her, Hermione Jean Granger, general of the recently expanded Sunshine Regiment, who was getting the best grades in the first year of Hogwarts classes, and who had declared herself a heroine. Even her name was shorter than his. The headmaster smiled benevolently at her, his wrinkle-lined eyes twinkling cheerfully beneath their half-circles of glass, and said, "Hello, Miss Granger." The odd thing was that it wasn't nearly as scary as talking to Professor Quirrell. "Hello, Headmaster Dumbledore," Hermione said with only a slight quaver in her voice. "Miss Granger," said Dumbledore, now looking more serious, "I think you and I may have had a bit of a misunderstanding. I did not mean to imply that you could not, or should not be a hero. I certainly did not mean to imply that witches in general should not be heroes, only that you were a bit young to be thinking of such things." Hermione, unable to help herself, glanced at Professor McGonagall and saw that Professor McGonagall was giving her an encouraging smile, or she was giving the two of them some kind of smile anyway. So Hermione looked back at the headmaster and said, the small quaver in her voice a little larger now, "Since you became headmaster 40 years ago, there have been 11 students to graduate Hogwarts who became heroes. I mean people like Lupe Cazerel and so on, and 10 of those were boys. Cimmerin Linderwall was the only witch." said the headmaster. There was a thoughtful expression on his face. He at least seemed to be thinking about it. "Miss Granger, I have never been one for tallying such numbers. Often it is too much easier to count than to understand. Many good people have come out of Hogwarts, witches and wizards both. Those famed as heroes are only one kind of good person, and perhaps not the highest. You did not include Alice Longbottom or Lily Potter in your reckoning. But leave that aside. Tell me, Miss Granger, did you tally how many heroes came out of Hogwarts in the 40 years before me? For in that time I can recall only 3 now called heroes, and among those 3 no witches at all. I'm not trying to say it's just you," Hermione said. "Only I think maybe a lot of people, like the headmasters before you two, maybe even your whole society and everything, might be discouraging girls." The old wizard sighed. His half-glasses eyes looked only at her, as though they were the only 2 people present. "Miss Granger, it might be possible to discourage witches from becoming charms mistresses, or Quidditch players, or even auras, but not heroes. If someone is meant to be a hero, then a hero they will be. They will walk through fire and swim through ice. Dementors will not stop them, nor the deaths of friends, and not discouragement either." "Well," Hermione said, and paused, struggling with the words. "Well, I mean, what if that's not actually true? I mean, to me it seems that if you want more witches to be heroes, you ought to teach them heroing. Many boys and girls are heroes in their dreams," Dumbledore said quietly. He did not look at any of the other girls, only at her. "Fewer in the waking world. Many have stood their ground and faced the darkness when it comes for them. Fewer come for the darkness and force it to face them. It is a hard life, sometimes lonely, often short. I have told none to refuse that calling, but neither would I wish to increase their number." Hermione hesitated. There was something in the lined face that stopped her, like a hint to all the emotion that wasn't being displayed, years and years of it. Maybe if there were more heroes, their lives wouldn't be so lonely or so short. She couldn't bring herself to say that, though, not to him. "But the point is moot," said the old wizard. He smiled, a bit ruefully, she thought. "Miss Granger, you cannot teach heroism like you would teach charms. You cannot assign 12 inches on how to carry on when all hope seems lost. You cannot rehearse students on when to stand up and tell the headmaster he has done wrong. Heroes are born, not taught, and for whatever reason, more of them are born boys than girls." The headmaster shrugged, as if to say that he was helpless to do anything about that. Hermione said. She couldn't help it. She glanced behind her. Professor Sinistra was looking a bit indignant, and it wasn't true that everyone was staring at her like she'd just been silly, the way she'd started to imagine while she was listening to Dumbledore. Hermione turned back to face Dumbledore again, took a deep breath, and said, "Well, maybe people who are going to be heroes will be heroes no matter what. But I don't see how anyone could really know that, aside from just saying it afterward. And when I told you that I wanted to be a hero, you weren't very encouraging." "Mr. Potter," the headmaster said mildly. His eyes didn't leave hers. "Please tell Miss Granger your impression of our own first meeting. Would you say that I was encouraging? Speak the truth." There was a pause. "Mr. Potter," said Professor Vector's voice from behind her, sounding puzzled. Harry's voice said from further back, sounding extremely reluctant. Well, actually, in my case, the headmaster set fire to a chicken." "He what?" Hermione blurted, only there were several other people exclaiming things at around the same time, so she wasn't sure anyone heard her. Dumbledore went on gazing at her, looking perfectly serious. "I didn't know about Fawkes," Harry's voice said rapidly, "so he told me that Fawkes was a phoenix, while he was pointing to a chicken on Fawkes's stand, so I'd think that was Fawkes. And then he set the chicken on fire, and also he gave me this big rock, and told me it had belonged to my father and I ought to carry it everywhere. But that's crazy," Susan blurted out. There was a sudden hush. The headmaster slowly turned his head to stare at Susan. "I," said Susan. The headmaster leaned down until he was face to face with the young girl. "I didn't," said Susan. Dumbledore put a finger to his lips and twiddled them, making a bee-weeble sound. The headmaster straightened up again and said, "Well, my good heroines, it has been pleasant speaking to you, but alas, much else remains to do this day. Still, rest assured that I am inscrutable at everyone, not just witches." The gargoyle stepped aside, the flowing stone rumbling like rock as it moved like flesh. The huge ugly figures waited briefly with dead grey eyes, staring out in silent vigil, as Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, smiling as benevolently as when he'd first emerged from his office, stepped back into the enchantment of the endless stare. Then the great gargoyles folded their wings back into place and stepped back into their former positions, only one last brief BWA echoing out before the gap closed. There was a long silence. "He really set a chicken on fire," said Hannah. The 8 of them had continued protesting even after that, but to be honest, their heart had gone out of it. It had been established, after some careful questions from Professor Flitwick, that Harry Potter hadn't smelled the chicken burning, which meant that it had probably been a pebble or something, transfigured into a chicken, and then enclosed in a boundary charm to make sure that no smoke escaped into the air. Both Professor Flitwick and Professor McGonagall had been very emphatic about nobody trying that without their supervision. But still, what? Hermione didn't even know, but still what? But still. After a lot of glances exchanged between girls, none of whom had wanted to be first to say it, Hermione had declared the protest over, and the adults and boys had drifted off. "You don't think we were being unfair to Dumbledore, do you?" said Susan, as the heroines walked away to the sound of 8 pairs of feet trotting on the stone paving of Hogwarts's corridors. If he is crazy at everyone, and not just at witches, then it's not discrimination, right?" "I don't want to protest against the headmaster anymore," Hannah said weakly. The Hufflepuff girl seemed a bit unsteady on her feet. "I don't care what Professor McGonagall says about him not holding it against us. It's just too much for my nerves." Lavender snorted. "I guess you won't be slaying armies of Inferi anytime soon." "Stop that," Hermione said sharply. "Look, all of us have got to learn to be heroines, right? It's okay if someone doesn't know right away." "The headmaster doesn't think it can be learned," Padma said. The Ravenclaw girl's face was thoughtful, her steps measured as she strode through the corridor. "The headmaster doesn't even think that's a good idea." Daphne was striding with her back straight and her head held bolt upright, looking more like a proper young lady in her Hogwarts robes than Hermione could have done with her best formal dress. "The headmaster," Daphne said in a precise voice, her shoes making hard, sharp tacking sounds on the stone, "thinks the lot of us are a bunch of silly girls playing games, and that someday Hermione might make a good sidekick, but the rest of us are hopeless." "Is he right?" said Parvati. The Gryffindor girl's face was very serious, making her look much more like her twin than she usually did. I mean, it has to be asked. No, spat Tracy. Slytherin girl was stalking through the hallway looking ready to kill someone, like a miniature female Snape. Of all the girls, Tracy was the one who Hermione knew least. Hermione had talked to Lavender once before, but she'd never really seen Tracy except at one point during a battle, until the Slytherin had jumped up from her sofa to volunteer. We'll show him. We'll show them all. Okay, said Susan. That was definitely evil. No, said Lavender. That's a Chaos Legion motto, actually. Only she didn't do the insane laughter. That's right, Tracy said, her voice low and grim. This time I'm not laughing. The girl went on stalking through the corridor, like she had dramatic music accompanying her that only she could hear. Hermione was starting to worry about what exactly the impressionable youths of the Chaos Legion were learning from Harry Potter. But I mean, Parvati said. She still had a contemplative look on her face. I mean, you can see why the headmaster would think we were just silly girls, right? What does protesting outside the headmaster's office have to do with becoming heroines? Ha, Lavender said, now looking thoughtful herself. That's true. We should do something heroic. I mean heroinic. Said Hannah, which very much expressed Hermione's own feelings on the subject. Well, said Parvati, has everyone already been through Dumbledore's third-floor forbidden corridor? I mean, everyone in Gryffindor's been through it by now. Hold on, Hermione said desperately. I don't want you doing anything dangerous. There was a pause while everyone looked at Hermione, who was realizing, much too late, why Dumbledore hadn't wanted anyone else to be a hero. I don't think you can become a heroine if you never do anything dangerous, Lavender observed reasonably. Besides, said Padma, a considering look on her face. Everyone knows that nothing really bad ever happens in Hogwarts, right? To students, I mean, not to the defense professors. We've got all these ancient wards and so on. Hannah said again. Yeah, said Parvati. The worst that can happen is that we'll lose a few dozen house points or something, and there's 2 of us from each house, so that'll all come out even. Why, that's brilliant, Hermione, said Daphne in a tone of great amazement. The way you set it up means we can get away with anything. And I didn't even notice your cunning plan until now. Said Hermione, Hannah, and Susan. Right, said Parvati. So now it's time for us to become real heroines. We'll come for the darkness and make it face us, said Lavender. And teach it to be afraid, Tracy Davis said grimly.